One in five Howard Law graduates can't find a job right now. Howard's employment rate just dropped nearly 15 points in 1 year. 33 of their recent graduates are sitting at home right now, refreshing their LinkedIns, unemployed 10 months after graduation. Nobody else is reporting on this right now. I spent the past 2 days looking at the data, and it's not what I expected. Two doors closed at Howard this year, both at once. And Howard is virtually the only law school in the country where that happened. Now, here's what I thought the story was going to be. Summer of 2023, the Supreme Court strikes down race-based affirmative action in college admissions. But the real downstream effect wasn't on colleges, it was on corporate diversity programs. Within 12 months, a long list of law firms had restructured, renamed, or quietly wound down their diversity fellowship programs. Multiple law firms settled with the federal government over hiring practices, and the recruiting channels that used to carry graduates from historically black law schools into the biggest law firms either got smaller or disappeared entirely. Now, Howard Law's class of 2025 did their summer job interviews in the summer of 2024, the first full cycle after all of that happened. And so my thesis here was pretty simple. If Howard's graduates leaned on those diversity recruiting channels more than their peer schools did, they would walk into a market where the channels had just contracted, and Howard was going to feel it harder than any other school. So I ran the numbers, and it looked like I was right. Howard places roughly 60 graduates a year into the biggest law firms in the country. I'm talking firms with 500 attorneys or more. Those are the jobs that pay first-year lawyers more than most people earn in 10 years. The kind of job a Howard grad takes specifically because the money is what makes law school debt manageable. Last year, 58 Howard graduates landed one of those jobs. Only 45 of them landed one of those jobs this year, so that's 13 jobs gone in a single cycle. Nationally, placements at those firms shrunk about 8%. Howard's contracted 15%, almost double the national rate. Then I pulled the data for every historically black law school in the country. I added up their big firm numbers, 12% contraction at historically black schools, 8% everywhere else. So a 4-point gap that nobody else has reported on yet. At that point, I was ready to sit down and hit record, make a video for all of you. But then I looked at how each historically black school did individually, and what seemed like a clean story actually kind of fell apart. If diversity recruiting pullback were the whole story at Howard, every historically black law school would also be down. Different amounts, sure, but the same direction. But that's not actually what the data shows. Take, for example, North Carolina Central, another historically black law school. Same graduating class as Howard, same national job market. Their unemployment rate dropped from 12.7% last year down to 7.3% this year. So they cut their unemployment in half. Florida A&M improved. Texas Southern's big firm placements actually grew. So two other historically black schools held steady. Only Howard and one other school collapsed. And that other school, University of the District of Columbia, has basically zero big firm placements to begin with. And so their collapse can't be about big firms. So the historically black aggregate story is still real. Big firms pulled back from these schools faster than from everybody else. And that's news, sure. But that alone doesn't explain why Howard's unemployment tripled while North Carolina Central's got cut in half. There is something else that broke at Howard on top of the big firm pullback, and so I want to figure out what that is. Now, Howard reports where its graduates end up to the American Bar Association in 14 different categories. I pulled the data on all of them, did the math on every single one. Most categories barely moved. Government jobs actually went up for Howard. Public interest went up a little bit. Federal clerkships held steady. Small and mid-sized firms wiggled a little bit in both directions, basically a wash. There are two categories that did almost all the damage. The first one is big firms. Already talked about that, down 13%. But here is the second one, and this is the part that nobody else is covering. State and local clerkships. A clerkship is where you spend a year or two working directly for a judge after you graduate. You help them write opinions, you help them research cases, it's prestigious, and it's almost always a stepping stone to a better job a year or two later. Now, state and local clerkships at Howard means DC. the DC Superior Court, the DC Court of Appeals, specialty courts around the city. It's a historically stable path, keeps Howard grads in DC, builds their local network, rolls into private practice a year or two later. Last year, 15 Howard graduates got those jobs. This year, only 5 people got those jobs, only 5 graduates. So 2/3 of that pipeline gone in one cycle. So I checked for the other historically black law schools, and their state clerkship numbers were basically flat. So this is not happening across historically black schools. Then I checked the other DC area law schools. Georgetown's state clerkships went up by 3%, American universities went up by 9%, Catholics went up by 5%. GW basically held flat. So every other DC school either held or grew their state clerkship placements. Howard is the only school in the city where those jobs evaporated. So that rules out a lot here. It's not diversity recruiting. It's not the federal government. It's not a DC-wide court hiring freeze. Other DC schools placed more graduates into those same courts. It's something specific to Howard's relationship with the DC courts in the class of 2025. Now, big firms pull back from dozens of schools this year. Berkeley lost 61 placements, Boston College lost 70, Texas lost 69, Emory lost 36, but none of their employment rates collapsed. Because at every one of those schools, other placement channels absorbed the hit. State clerkships held steady, government hiring held, business jobs held. When big firms pulled back, there was somewhere else for those students to go. Big firms is one door, and those schools had other doors open. Howard had both doors close on them at the same time. So I pulled the data for every law school in America when the American Bar Association dropped their employment numbers yesterday. I filtered for schools that lost 8 or more big firm placements and lost 8 or more state or local clerkships in the same year. There were only 3 law schools in the entire country that fit that profile: Howard, George Mason, and Seton Hall. George Mason's unemployment stayed flat. Seton Hall's actually improved. Only Howard's exploded. Even inside the tiny group of schools hit by the same 2 losses at the same time, Howard is still the outlier. 2 doors closing was not enough to break George Mason, wasn't enough to break Seton Hall, but it did break Howard Law. And that tells me there is a third factor amplifying what happened at Howard. And I have some theories about what that is that I'm going to share. Now, the one that I think matters most, although I can't fully prove it yet, is that Howard expanded its class this year. 147 graduates last year, 155 this year. That's 8 more students walking across the stage, a 5% bigger class, into a market that was actively shrinking Howard's 2 biggest placement channels. So think about what that means for the Career Services office at Howard. Last year, they had 147 students and placed almost all of them. This year, they had 155, but fewer jobs to place them into than existed 12 months earlier. The system was not built to handle class growth in the year when the pipeline was simultaneously contracting. If you add students into a shrinking market, you break the entire placement machinery. So that alone accounts for a big piece of the gap between Howard and the peer schools that absorbed the double hit. There's a second possibility as well: bar passage rates. If fewer Howard graduates pass the bar exam on their first try this summer, those graduates can't take jobs that require being a licensed lawyer. They'll show up in the data as unemployed, even if they did everything right in law school. Now, the data on Howard's July 2025 first-time bar passage rates is not public yet, but if it dropped, that's a big part of the answer. A third possibility: Howard has deeper exposure to big firms than most historically black law schools. In other words, big firm placement is a bigger share of Howard's class than it is at North Carolina Central or Florida A&M. And so when big firms pull back across the board, Howard's going to take a bigger share of the pain. Not a separate factor, it's more of an amplifier of the first 2. Now, what this looks like on the ground is one bad cycle at one school in one year with several different independent problems stacking up on top of each other in the worst possible timing, essentially a perfect storm. Now, if you're applying to law school this cycle, this matters even if you're not looking at Howard. Your question is not what's the employment rate. Your real question is, if the biggest channel at this law school shrinks 15% in a year, what's going to absorb the hit? At Berkeley, Boston College, Emory, other channels were able to absorb it. But at Howard, a second channel collapsed at the exact same time, and there was nothing left. Now, every law school has a placement pipeline, one or two channels doing most of the work. And so if you're evaluating a given law school, you want to know which channels carry their employment and whether there's any cushion if the market takes a turn. Now, a 15-point employment collapse is a pretty big warning sign. And so if you're considering Howard, if you're considering any law school really, you want to walk into admissions with a couple of questions in mind. First, what was the class of 2025's first-time bar passage rate? Second, if big firm placements dropped, why? If local clerkships dropped, if state clerkships dropped, you also want to ask why. And what concrete steps is the school taking to restore placements in these channels? And if the admissions can't give you hard numbers, if they just give you vague reassurances, you've got your answer, right? And none of this means don't go to Howard or don't go to any other given law school. It means go in with your eyes open, negotiate scholarships harder, understand the network you're actually joining when you attend that particular law school. And of course, if you want to maximize your law school options, get into better law schools with better employment outcomes, you want to get better scholarship offers. The single best way to do that is to get a higher LSAT score, ideally above the medians of the schools to which you're applying. Gets you more scholarship money, maybe even a full ride, helps you have more optionality upon graduating so that you can choose the jobs you really want to pursue.